The name of my guest today may not yet mean much to an Israeli audience listening to us now, but for many around the world, Natasha Hausdorff is one of the most intelligent, courageous, and eloquent voices of Israeli advocacy. Even before October 7th, Hausdorff, a barrister in London, an expert in international law, and the director of UK Lawyers for Israel, provided factual information about what is happening here in Israel quite a few times in front of unfriendly audiences. From debates at Cambridge University and the University of Dublin, houses of parliament throughout Europe and around the world, many television channels, including hold her own, when interviewed by the very hostile BBC. So, Natasha Hausdorff, thank you very much for joining me from London.
Matan, it's great to be with you, and I'm very grateful for the extremely kind words.
Thank you very much. It's really my privilege. So today I would like us to go into depth from point of view of international law, the ICC, the status of the Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria, and much more. But first, a little bit about you. As I mentioned in the introduction, you are the director of UK Lawyers for Israel. Can you tell us a little bit about this organization and its work?
Certainly. Currently, I serve as legal director of UK Lawyers for Israel Charitable Trust, which is our charitable arm. But it's an organization I've volunteered for over a decade, a voluntary association of lawyers looking for the proper application of law to Israel, Israelis, combating anti-Semitism. We do everything from assisting students on campus to battling BDS at local authority or even at government level. And liaising with other like-minded organizations around the world. What we tend not to do is, I think, what many people expect us to do, which is litigate, bring cases. That's expensive, risky, and actually we have found we are able to achieve an incredible success in ensuring that the law is properly applied and upheld through writing letters. And we have wonderful support from patrons of both organizations, UK Lawyers for Israel and UKLFI Charitable Trust, who are the leaders of the former judiciary and lawyers here in the United Kingdom. And our positions are taken very seriously, be it by government organizations or companies. So that's been an incredible project to be involved in, as I say, for well over a decade. But since the 7th of October, we have been even more inundated than previously, and there are many legal battles to fight.
How has your work of explaining Israel's narrative changed since October 7th?
Well, it's definitely become more prominent. I would still say that it's very difficult to engage with what many people refer to as the mainstream media. It seems that any commentators that are putting forth either the facts or the law, which don't necessarily keep to the agenda, which I think we can all see quite palpably across many media outlets, they're not so keen to interview commentators of that sort so frequently. Nonetheless, the hunger for accurate analysis of both the law and the facts has been palpable. And on the basis of increasing media engagement, the response that I have received from around the world, from people, not all of them Jewish, who recognize a great deal more of the reality than I'm afraid we see in our newspapers or on our television screens around the world. They understand the essence of the fight that Israel is engaged in. And the response in letters, emails, messages has been overwhelming from around the world, I have to say.
Wow, I thought of asking this question later, but because you've mentioned media, so to what extent does the BBC and bodies like it have a role in shaping the mind of the average British citizen towards Israel, or does it simply reflect public opinion?
Think it has a huge role in shaping not just British public opinion, but of course, the British Broadcasting Corporation is viewed around the world and has an incredibly long reputation of being a credible source of news. So people take very seriously what they see on it. And when we see repeated misreporting, I mean, there are some very well-known examples of this now, such as the Al-Ahli hospital strike, the BBC's coverage of the first provisional measures ruling of the ICJ in January, where it was saying, along with everyone else, that Israel was plausibly guilty of genocide. More recently, with respect to the ongoing operation in Rafah and the fallout of the strike on Sunday evening. All of this, of course, feeds into the narrative that has been of some long-standing. I have to stress that, especially with the BBC, this agenda is not a new one. It has been the subject of debate and certainly reports previously here in the United Kingdom. But what we have seen over the last 7 months is the whole thing on our television screens every single day.
Exploding, yeah.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about the ICC. Later, I'm going to ask about the genocide claims. But is there a real threat to Israel from the ICC today, from your point of view?
So the reality is that there shouldn't be, because the court lacks jurisdiction to investigate as it currently has done. Nonetheless, the threats that we're seeing from what is a legal organization, I think, are largely politically motivated. Despite the absence of jurisdiction, and this is key because a state of Palestine doesn't exist. There are recognized criteria in international law. They come from the Montevideo Convention, and they set out that a state must have defined borders, a permanent population, government, and the capacity to enter into international relations. Despite this, the so-called State of Palestine purported to join the court by signing on to the Rome Statute. And there was, in 2021, already an application by the previous prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda, to the court for a ruling on jurisdiction. And we saw there that the pre-trial chamber was, I can only put it like this, engaging in the legal acrobatics that the prosecutor had put forward in order to establish jurisdiction in this case. And because Israel is not a signatory to the court, that ruling has formed the basis of the previous prosecutor's investigation, and now the current prosecutor, Karim Khan, and his application for arrest warrants that I know your audience is going to be very familiar with. It's predicated on the basis that the state of Palestine, so-called, has the ability to join the Rome Statute, and therefore the court says it has jurisdiction over the territory of that state, which is quite surprising, and also over the acts of any nationals of that state. And I'll just add this one element. The decision by the prosecutor to present himself as acting in some sort of even-handed situation by issuing arrest warrants both against the leaders of Hamas and against the democratically elected leadership in Israel in respect of Netanyahu and Gallant is monstrous. It is preposterous, but it is not surprising. And unfortunately, I think it has been borne out of a, they say, unfortunate, naive desire, especially on the part of victims of the 7th of October and their families, to engage with the court. I think it's extremely problematic because the court clearly doesn't have jurisdiction. I can entirely understand the desire for international recognition of the clear suffering of these individuals. But we have seen very, very unfortunately the result of that, and Khan's interview that he gave to Christian Amanpour and the political position he has taken here in drawing this abhorrent, morally repugnant equivalence between Hamas and Israel.
Okay, so the key element to remember here, as you said, that there is no recognition of a Palestinian state, right? So is the reaction of countries like Spain or Norway, which officially recognize such a state, surprised you? And what are the consequences of such a move for Israel, in your opinion, and with all this going on with the ICC?
So I need to make a distinction here between the criteria for statehood that I've set out, which are recognized in customary international law. It's a fundamental aspect of international law, and recognition. They don't always go hand in hand. And here we have seen political recognitions of a state of Palestine, despite it lacking the relevant attributes for statehood. And that's why I would draw a distinction here between the legal aspects and the political aspects. And I do see these recent recognitions as political statements. They also reflect political resolutions that we've seen at the United Nations. Technically speaking, they don't have legal impact, but increasingly, with respect to Israel, we are seeing the erosion of barriers between law and politics. That was at the center of the decision made by the ICC with respect to jurisdiction. It may very well also have influenced the sorts of determinations that we've had from the International Court of Justice. It clearly underpins many of the resolutions that are couched in legal terms at organizations like the UN Human Rights Council. That is another political organization with an extreme agenda against Israel, so much so that they have a freestanding agenda item just to focus on the Jewish state. So it's important to recognize that these attempts to deploy legal terminology, including in the context of recognition of statehood, are exercises, I would say, of lawfare. They are abuses of international law. They are not reflective of the legal position in reality, but they inevitably may very well have consequences down the line as more and more legal institutions are picking up on these political narratives and are deploying them themselves.
Right before this interview, I understood from an Israeli expert in international law that if South Africa will petition the court again, so the ICC will demand Israel to stop the war. Is this a real threat to Israel, maybe from this perspective?
Just need to be careful that South Africa's applications have been to the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, and that is a court. It also sits in The Hague, as does the
Oh,
ICJ.
sorry, so I mixed
No,
up
no, no. And
ICC and ICJ.
the media is doing it all the time. So the ICJ also sits in The Hague, but it has jurisdiction over states. It deals with state-to-state disputes, and it also deals. It has another mechanism where it considers advisory opinions. And if we've got time, that there's another lawfare initiative against Israel under that mechanism also. But in terms of the question of, what happens if South Africa makes another application, well, don't forget that South Africa has already made 4 provisional measures applications demanding that Israel cease immediately its operation in Gaza. And it's very important that the court has, on each of these 4 occasions, declined to make such an order. Now, there are many reasons for that. One basic one is that even the politicized International Court of Justice recognizes that Israel has an inherent right to self-defense. That is reflected in Article 51 of the UN Charter. And it's as basic as you can get. It's every government's primary responsibility to defend its citizens, to keep its citizens safe. And that is what Israel has been doing since the 7th of October, despite international interference, which has, I think your audience may agree, in many respects, hamstrung Israel and drawn out this conflict. So given that South Africa has made this application already 4 times previously, I would hope that a future identical application would be met with a similar rejection. But what we have seen is the court on each of these occasions finds itself under increasing political pressure. So much so that last week we had an order that was presented in the international media as though it was ordering Israel to immediately cease its operation. Now, if the journalists reporting on that case had read the separate declarations of the judges, including those that supported the provisional measures order, Judge Orescu and Judge Nolte, or indeed the dissenting declaration of Judge Sebutinde and ad hoc Judge Barak, then the meaning of the order would not have been ambiguous at all. It's clear that the court is pushing at the boundaries, and I would also say that it is out with its proper application of both provisional measures and the provisions of the Genocide Convention, and the dissenting judgment of the Ugandan judge Sebutinde sets out extremely clearly and very articulately where the court is going wrong here. So on each occasion, it's pushing at those boundaries. I hope that it will still remain semi-credible, but as I say, that time seems to be very much running out, especially because it's put out orders now that have been universally, it seems, misinterpreted. And that also reflects extremely poorly on what is the top court of the United Nations.
How do you deal specifically with the claim that Israel is committing a genocide in Gaza?
It's difficult to know where to start unpacking that falsehood. Of course, we know the origins of the term of genocide. It was coined by Raphael Lemkin to provide a legal lexicon to what had been perpetrated against the Jews in the Holocaust, that there simply wasn't legal language around to describe the mass slaughter, the concerted effort to eradicate a race from the face of the earth. We, of course, see a repeat of acts of genocide by Hamas and other Palestinian terrorist groups that crossed Israel's border on the 7th of October. And so, taking that as a starting point, the fact that the real victims of genocide here are being blamed for the crimes that were perpetrated against them is mind-boggling. But there is an explanation as to why South Africa has deployed this false allegation, and it's because it provides a legal hook to bring Israel to the court. I mentioned that the ICC, the International Criminal Court, does not have jurisdiction to investigate the matters it is looking into. The International Court of Justice does have jurisdiction over Israel with respect to its obligations under the Genocide Convention, because Israel has allowed the court that authority. And so that's why South Africa has used this legal hook of genocide to bring Israel to the court. That's why Israel has partaken in these proceedings, unlike at the International Criminal Court.
And Israel should not have participated in the proceedings in the ICJ in the first place?
I think that's an extremely difficult decision for a country that prizes law and order and the rule of law and considers itself to be a law-abiding state to take. Israel is stuck between a rock and a hard place, because while it recognizes real international law and in fact has a long and substantial track record of applying international law, even domestically in the courts, what we are witnessing at the ICJ is a farce. It is not the proper application of international law. So I imagine that Israel will inevitably keep its involvement at the court under review. I'll just give you one example of the level of farce that has been reached. I mean, the president of the court, Judge Salem, is I'm going to say, in any other context, I would have expected a recusal under Article 17 of the statute governing the court. This is an individual who not only is a judge from an enemy state of Israel, and let's not forget that the Lebanese government is essentially allowing Hezbollah to commit war crimes against Israelis on a daily basis from the north, but he also has a personal track record of making unfounded allegations against Israel in his previous capacity as ambassador at the United Nations, accusing Israel of apartheid and terror and war crimes. The idea that he is in any way impartial or has not prejudged these issues because of his own political perspective is simply not credible.
Prior to the outbreak of the war, you participated in a debate at the University of Dublin. A point you brought up in the debate was that the Palestinian population overwhelmingly supports Hamas, even today. 3,000 people just don't get up in one day and commit such a barbaric acts as we saw in October 7th. This is a very important point, I think, which is very difficult for Westerners to hear. because they naturally separate civilians from terrorist fighters. What is the reaction you get to this kind of point?
Well, the debate in Dublin was shortly after the 7th of October, and I will not forget that occasion because the first question that I was asked by the audience was, "Where is your evidence for the 7th of October?" So
I
that gives you
remember this, yeah. They even laughed, I think, when you talked about the evidence.
Indeed, and that gives you an indication of the unfortunately that the quality of the students who were attending in Dublin. Well, when I spoke at that debate in Dublin, I referenced that the 4,000 terrorists that had crossed the border, not all of them Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad. We now know that supposedly civilians unaffiliated with these organizations also partook in these atrocities. And the point that I made was that if one looks at UN statistics, about 3/4 of those individuals would have been educated in UNRWA-run schools, and they have been indoctrinated from kindergarten on to believe that the highest calling in life is to become a martyr and to slaughter as many Jews as possible. And until we recognize what is at the core of this ability of people to get up one morning and commit those sorts of atrocities and to threaten to commit them over and over again, we have to be honest about what has been done to the Palestinian population with international support. And it's not just the indoctrination, but it is also the incentivization towards terror, which is being funded by the international community through the Palestinian Authority Pay for Slay program. That is something that the international community still seems to wish to turn a blind eye to. And we have even seen some countries that had suspended their funding to UNRWA reinstating it. So that is the key problem. And undoubtedly, as a result of that indoctrination, we've also had pretty shocking polling in terms of the level of support that still exists for Hamas, not just in Gaza, but of course also in the West Bank. The only route to changing that society based on terror is going to come down to education. And there are partners for this process, I'm sure, in the international community. The UAE has had enormous success in its de-radicalization efforts. And there is also a precedent for this, I would suggest, in the context of the Marshall Plan and Germany after the Second World War and the process of denazification, but that has to be done with international cooperation in this case.
I just had a podcast in Hebrew just on this case, on how to make the Marshall Plan that have been implicated in Germany now in Gaza. Let's talk a little bit about Ireland. It seems that Ireland has deeply rooted hatred for Israel. Do you think that there is any chance in the near future that Irish people will even listen to Israel's narrative? In other words, is this battle of public opinion in this country is not already lost for us?
I've spoken a number of times in Ireland, and I think it's important to stress that this is not reflective of all Irish people. Plainly, the issue it plays out quite strongly in Irish politics, and there are historical reasons for that, an affiliation, unfortunately, by many of the parties with terrorist organizations, and that is potentially getting worse. There are sensible parties vying for further political influence. But ultimately, it comes down to what the messaging is and what is being put out in terms of the media in Ireland. And if you can believe it, I think that the narrative there against Israel is even worse than in the United Kingdom. And we see that reflective across activities on university campuses, protests, and increasingly in the context of political resolutions as well.
And in the stands of Celtic fans, which I've always didn't really like Celtic, always preferred Rangers. So after almost 9 months of war, many Israelis have given up on the fight for legitimacy in the eyes of the world. Are there things you would suggest Israel will do differently in regards to bring our narrative to the Western world?
I would encourage a bit more tachlis. I think that it's important that we don't sugarcoat reality. that we are clear also that Israel is fighting the West's war for it. And there has been, over many, many decades, I would say, an inclination to be apologetic for Israel standing up and defending itself. I hope that the lessons of the last 7 months are such that there is a change of approach in that respect. Because if we are being overly apologetic for something as simple as self-defense, then I don't think we can hold out much hope for the international community sticking its neck out to support Israel in its continuous battles against terrorism. So that would be my hope and expectation. But plainly, we also need to be investing far more in getting the truth out. And that is with respect to the factual position. One of the difficulties, of course, that Israel has is it's a responsible, law-abiding state with institutions that act according to law and are accountable. And that means that the IDF, government ministries don't rush out with information which hasn't been checked multiple times. The flip side of that, of course, is that Hamas and other terrorist organizations put out propaganda which is plainly false in many respects, but because it is the first out on the scene, this is what is parroted by the international media.
Mhm.
I'm aware that there are efforts to speed up the processes of Israel's responses, and I think we've already seen a significant improvement in the priority that is given to making the case and putting the accurate information out, and hopefully that's a trend that will increase.
Let's talk a little bit. I know you have a lot to say about it, but just a little bit about the West Bank. So many people in the world, and not few people in the Israeli left, even today, are sure that the very existence of the Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria, known as the West Bank, although I don't really like this term, are violent international law. So it seems that even people who are supporters of Israel have a hard time defending us when it comes to the settlement issue. I would appreciate if you could explain whether the Jewish settlements in Judea and Samaria really violate international law.
So I appreciate the narrative that has taken hold. I also remember hearing Alan Dershowitz speak, probably coming on to 2 decades ago now, saying, my generation dropped the ball. We didn't push back on terms like occupation when they were being used incorrectly, and now they have taken hold. And I think the message that was being given was plainly that we need to be pushing back against the new false terms, apartheid, ethnic cleansing, colonialism, genocide, because otherwise they will take hold in a similar fashion. But my takeaway from that is that we cannot allow false terminology like that to be deployed, and that the term occupation also needs to be robustly pushed back against. There is clear international law that applies in these situations. I'm not asking for any special case to be made for Israel. I'm certainly not basing any arguments on a historical presence or even a religious justification. All I'm saying
You're
is
not taking the Bible and say, well, because the Bible speaks of the people in Israel, so it's our land. No.
certainly not. There may be others who wish to advance that argument, but all I'm calling for is an equal application of international law. And the starting date for that is Israel's Declaration of Independence on the 14th of May, 1948. There is a rule universally applied in customary international law that determines the borders of states when they come into existence. It was reaffirmed by the International Court of Justice, which described that it had emerged in the 19th century in South America with the withdrawal of the Spanish. It was later applied in Asia and in Africa, and at the dissolution of the former communist federations, for example, with Yugoslavia. It's also applied to all states that emerge from mandates. And the rule is a default rule. It applies where there's no agreement to the contrary. And it states that the new state inherits the pre-existing administrative lines of whatever entity preceded it. Now, we know that after the severance of Transjordan, the administrative line of the British Mandate, which preceded the State of Israel, ran down along the Jordan River and to the Red Sea. And that incorporates Judea and Samaria, East Jerusalem, what is frequently referred to as the West Bank, according to the proper application of international law and this rule of uti possidetis juris.
Euros. Yes.
Uti possidetis juris.
It's my way to say to you that I've prepared something for this interview. Yeah.
I think we should get T-shirts made. This is something that is not in dispute. It's not controversial in any other context. And in fact, the reason that this rule came into existence was, as the International Court of Justice recognized, to promote stability and certainty and to provide clean lines and to prevent fratricidal struggles. So the notion that it would be disapplied in Israel's case simply doesn't make any sense, not in the context of the international law that applies, nor in the context of the reasons that this law was developed. What we saw, of course, immediately after Israel's declaration of independence, where its borders crystallized along those lines, the pre-existing administrative lines of the British Mandate, is that it was attacked by 5 Arab armies, and Jordan occupied Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem from 1949 to 1967, when Israel recovered that territory in the 67 war. I mean, there is a parallel example of the application of uti possidetis juris, which I think is extremely pertinent. Ukraine's borders followed that rule of customary international law. Now, if Ukraine were to recover Crimea from Russia, which everyone agrees Russia has occupied from Crimea because of the rule of uti possidetis juris. If Ukraine were to recover that territory in its war at the moment with Russia, no one would accuse Ukraine of occupying Crimea. And yet that is the allegation that is leveled after Israel recovered this disputed territory from Jordan. I mean, the other aspect to highlight here is that a situation of occupation has never outlived a peace agreement. The framework of the law of occupation developed in international law to protect a previous sovereign's rights throughout a time when territory came under the control of another sovereign. And when there was a peace agreement that regularized the situation, that either redrew the boundaries or formed some form of future status between the relevant states, any situation of occupation ended. This much was even recognized in the Hansel Memorandum, which was the memo produced by the State Department in the United States that so many people used to justify this false allegation that settlements were illegal. Well, even the Hansel Memorandum recognized that a peace agreement between Jordan and Israel would change the situation. Of course, it was written before the 1994 peace agreement with Jordan. It's important just also to clarify that the legal status, the underlying legal status of the territory, doesn't in any way prejudge what a political resolution should be. And of course, since the formation of the Palestinian Authority and the creation of areas A, B, and C in the West Bank, Israel has engaged in international agreements, which may arguably have changed the underlying status. But what you cannot do is say that because Israel applied in 1967 a temporary administrative framework to the territory, where it applied certain aspects of the law of armed conflict, of occupation, you cannot say that that changes the underlying status of the territory. That just doesn't follow through in international law. And there's an added important clarification and example here. Israel did treat Jerusalem differently from the way that it treated the rest of the West Bank. I think it's generally accepted that there was an anticipation that in a peace agreement with Jordan, the Land for Peace formula would entail Israel giving Jordan some of the West Bank in order to form a peace treaty. But with Jerusalem, Israel immediately applied its law, administration, and jurisdiction to what was already its underlying sovereign territory. And Abba Eban, in a letter to the UN Secretary General at the time, made it very clear that this was not annexation. I would suggest you cannot annex what is already your own sovereign territory. It's why in the discussion...
An example in the modern terms for annexation maybe should be how Germany did it to Austria in 1938, right, or something like that. This is exactly annexation.
Yes, although that also involved arguably a political agreement with the Austrian government. So it's not as straightforward necessarily as, say, for example, Jordan's occupation of the West Bank in 1948-49 and its purported annexation, which was only recognized, I think, by two states, so that didn't get very far. But that's pretty significant. And I know that several years ago, when there was discussion about Israel applying civil law to parts of Area C, again, this misguided term annexation was being used. And I think one of the reasons it is false is for the reason set out by Abba Eban already in 1967 with respect to what Israel was doing in Jerusalem.
Okay, so because of the settlements, Israel is frequently accused of being an apartheid state. I remember myself how the owner of the Israeli left-wing newspaper Haaretz expressed himself this way. What is your response to this accusation of apartheid?
Again, it's false, and I would say it is essentially a blood libel. It's being deployed for a very specific reason. Like South Africa's alleged genocide as a legal hook to get Israel to the ICJ, apartheid has consequences attached to it. The label of apartheid on South Africa brought with it essentially boycott, divestment, and sanctions, and that is why it has been a key centerpiece of what the BDS movement is alleging against Israel. When you look at the reports of some human rights organizations like Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch that have thrown their weight against this term, it's very telling that they look at the population, Jewish and Arab, between the river and the sea. Not only do they negate essentially the status of Israeli Arab citizens, who are the only free Arabs in the Middle East, the only Arabs to live in a real democracy with full equal rights, but they also infantilize the Palestinians and completely take away the existence of the Palestinian Authority and the autonomy that exists, not just in the West Bank in areas A and B, but also, of course, in the Gaza Strip. And we have seen what has happened since Israel's withdrawal in 2005 with full Palestinian control, autonomy, self-governance in Gaza. Hamas has spent the last 16 years embedding itself in the civilian population with its terror infrastructure in every second house by some reports. So that is a reality that is not just whitewashed or wallpapered over, but utterly and blatantly misrepresented, even by these prior respected leaders of human rights discourse, organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. But the reason that they have to put forward this false analysis is because the reality of the situation, as anyone knows who has visited Israel, is that apartheid couldn't be further from the truth. When I served at the Supreme Court, I served under an Arab justice. We have Arab members of Knesset serving in every echelon of public life. And I have been extremely struck by the commitment of many members of the Israeli Arab community to their state, by serving in the army, by volunteering and assisting with the war effort in the last 7 months. And I have to say, when I hear Israeli Arabs saying, "Ein li eretz acheret," it stands testament to what Israel has been able to achieve in giving the Arab Israeli population an opportunity to engage in democracy, to become full, flourishing members of society, and to realize their potential in a way that the Palestinian Arabs who are living under the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and Hamas in Gaza could only dream of.
I want to take you back to a debate you had at Cambridge University with Professor Avi Schleim, a controversial and anti-Zionist historian. I'll just note here that in this podcast, Professor Yoav Gelber, who is a really high distinguished Israeli historian, said to me that Schleim is a complete charlatan. What do you say about the phenomenon that perhaps a great deal of the ammunition given to Israel haters in the world comes from Israeli leftists who go around the world and speak against us?
It's true. And it's not just individuals, but it's also certain so-called human rights organizations. But I think the only thing that can be done is prove them wrong with the facts. It's extremely harmful, and one has to question what the motivation of these individuals could possibly be, because unlike certain unsuspecting, Western enthusiasts for human rights and international law, they should know better. In so many respects, they do know better, and yet they pursue a narrative which is false, perhaps because it makes them popular in the international community, that they focus on the world's punching bag, that is the Jewish state, or that they gain recognition as a quote unquote good Jew. It's a matter for them. But I think from the position of those that seek to uphold the reality and proper application of the law, and that push back against a rewriting of history, it simply means that those efforts need to be redoubled.
So let's talk a little bit about UK and European politics. At the moment, the polls in the UK are predicting a victory for the Labour Party. This looks like more bad news for Israel, doesn't it?
I'm afraid so.
Can you tell us a little bit about the Muslim vote movement? I know that it's a big thing right now in the UK. And what trends does it reflect in Britain?
There are certainly reports that it is being courted very significantly by the Labour Party. There are also reports that the UK population is becoming increasingly divided. Issues to do with immigration have proved extremely controversial for the current government. And in fact, it sought to emulate Israel's prior policy with respect to having asylum claims dealt with in Rwanda, as opposed to here in the United Kingdom. That was presented as an incentive or as a means of disincentivizing people from crossing the English Channel in small boats and coming to the UK to stake an asylum claim here. So those are all issues I'm sure that are going to be pretty front and center in the coming election. But one thing which is possibly surprising is that despite the cost of living crisis, despite the immigration issues, and despite many other questions as to the future of universities in the UK, one of the key issues that Labour is seeking to focus on in this election is Gaza. And we see the clear division of lines, especially since the election was called. But even before that, with the the person that is tipped to be the next Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, basically endorsing Karim Khan's application of arrest warrants against Israelis, saying that this is an independent court and it should be supported by the UK. We've had also promises from prominent Labour politicians that they would recognise a state of Palestine. So the trajectory is clear, but what seems, I think, pretty extraordinary for individual British citizens who don't necessarily focus their entire energies and efforts on the Middle East, the fact that this is becoming such a key election issue is perhaps surprising, but also extremely telling of where this future Labour government seeks to position itself.
Okay, so I won't do on the next holiday in England. Maybe it's going to be difficult for us.
Well, if you can make it before the 4th of July, come on over.
On several occasions, you've spoken about the lack of security in the streets of London that stems from the huge pro-Hamas demonstrations in London, mainly for Jews who are the convenient target. What future does British Jewry have in such a situation?
We've seen quite a significant escalation actually over the last couple of days, and some 40 arrests that occurred in quite a violent exchange with police and pro-Palestinian protesters, pro-Hamas protesters, as some referred to them only yesterday. But plainly, the police's failure to deal with law breaking since the 7th of October, including breaches of the Public Order Act, calls for genocide of Jews, has only led to a worsening of that situation. Now, the consistent message from the police has essentially been that they don't have the resources to properly apply the law. If the police seek to arrest everyone who is chanting from the river to the sea, or calling for an intifada, then they'll simply be overwhelmed. And we've seen that balance between an insufficient number of police officers and thousands of protesters who have taken advantage of that imbalance. And I can only say that the situation hasn't been improving. The police are now certainly stepping up their efforts where they have themselves been physically attacked by protesters. But the no-go area in central London, especially as these protests have continued on a weekly basis for Jews, remains. Much of the Jewish community here in the UK is extremely intimidated by this. And since Rafah, and this is not just in the UK, but we have seen an exponential increase in the violence associated with these protests in the last week or so. That does seem to be organized and orchestrated, given that we have seen the same thing occurring in multiple different countries, and whether or not the police are now more willing to deal with these threats head on. I'm afraid we're going to have to wait and see as the next few weeks pan out.
I remember talking to it with late Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, but can you see that maybe a lot of British Jews gonna do an Aliyah because of what is happening in London?
So I believe that the general rates of Aliyah are increasing. I certainly see myself here on a very long shlichut, in every sense of the word. And I think that it is important that there are those here in the UK that are willing to stand up against the falsehoods and use every opportunity of setting the record straight. But my real concern, I suppose, is that in the context of the next Labour government, you may see an even greater influx from the UK on those going on Aliyah. I know from anecdotally individual conversations that it is a frequent topic of conversation around the Friday night dinner tables, and it is an unfortunate reflection of the reality. The flip side of that, of course, is that all of our friends in Israel are extremely enthusiastic and welcoming of those who do seek to make that journey.
A little bit again about the media. We talked about the BBC, but can we can actually watch your interviews on channels like Talk TV or GB News and listen to people in the UK like Nigel Farage, Neil Ferguson was on this podcast, and of course Douglas Murray, who supports Israel. Should we be encouraged that there is a glimmer of hope for Israel in the UK because of those voices?
Always be encouraged and have tikva. The fact of the matter is that there are very strong voices out there, and my expectation is that they do have real support. There is a silent majority. I still do hope in the UK that the problem is that they are mostly silent, but there is a portion of society that understand, as I indicated earlier, what Israel is up against, and the fact that the threats are not Israel's alone. This is a threat to Western liberal democratic values all over the world. And in that respect, as many Niles, Douglases, Nigels as there are, I think they encourage more people to be more vocal about their own concerns and to question what it is that is being put out in terms of the agenda against the state of Israel.
Is it fair to say that today mostly conservatives around the world is on our side, to your opinion?
I hope that Israel doesn't become a partisan issue. I don't think it should because this isn't political. What is right and what is wrong, what is accurate and what is false, that should never become political. But unfortunately, what we've seen both in the United States and now increasingly here in the United Kingdom, in advance of the election on the 4th of July, is that party lines are forming some battlegrounds. It will be extremely harmful, not just to Israel, but I think also to Western interests in the Middle East, if that trend continues. And I do hope that there are a sufficient number in the Labour Party here in the United Kingdom and the Democrats in the United States who recognise what is at stake and ensure that they pull their respective parties back onto the side of right here.
We saw really the cover of the British Economist about 2 months ago, I think, with the headline Israel Alone. It is sometimes quite hard to be optimistic today if you look at the what is going to be maybe an international isolation that we are experiencing. Are you optimistic about Israel's future?
I wonder if people's memories are quite short. Because as a student of history, I know that in Israel's 76 years, there have been previous occasions where it felt utterly isolated and alone, and where it felt that it was acting entirely against the odds. And we have seen the drive, the commitment, the endurance of Israelis throughout that troubled period. And we have seen Israel flourish and in every respect become a light unto the nations. These are absolutely dark times. And the reaction of the international community, albeit unsurprising, is certainly one that has made the situation even darker and has made Israel's mission against Hamas even harder. And yet, the country has come together in a way that I have personally never previously experienced or recognized. And if we think about the divisions before the 7th of October, that in and of itself is remarkable. Even in the political discussions that are happening at the moment between various political parties, at its core, I think Israel remains united in the war effort and in its commitment to the war aims as they were set out by the Prime Minister at the very start. And so that glimmer of hope, I think, needs to be recognized as more than a glimmer. It is a shining beacon, not just of hope, I believe, to Israelis, but also to those around the world that embrace the similar values of the Jewish state.
Natasha Hausdorff, I wanted to seek a better word than excited to do this conversation. מאוד התרגשתי. Thank you very much, really, from the deep of my heart. And I'm sure that I'm talking on behalf of really a lot of Israelis that can hear us right now.
I'm extremely grateful. Thank you, Matan. It's been my pleasure.